What's up, you guys? Tyler Huxford here, and for today's video, we're going to be talking about the pros as well as the cons of both long-term rental investments as well as short-term rental investments. Now, as we jump in, I'm going to start off by saying that the answer here is going to vary person to person and asset for asset. But this is a question I get fairly often as somebody who has, for a long time, been invested in multiple units of long-term rental real estate investments, as well as achieved superhost status on the AirB&B platform. And I'm here to provide the information you need, not the advice, but the information you need to make your own decision on whether long-term rentals or short-term rentals fit your investment portfolio the best in today's market. I'll also preface this by saying that as far as my investment strategy goes for real estate, I usually won't invest in a property unless I see opportunities to both rent long-term within that property as well as nightly rent that property. Especially when I'm considering nightly renting a unit, I always want to make sure that I can fall back on a long-term rental strategy in case I need to. But let's jump into it. Let's talk about long-term rental properties first. This has long been a staple for a lot of investors out there and a really great way to both boost wealth but also generate monthly passive income. So let's talk about the cons first. Let's kind of flip-flop it here. Let's talk about the cons first. Usually we talk about the pros first. Let's talk about the cons. Con number one, it's absolutely more work to check in on your long-term rental property. Sometimes landlords go months and even years before they even walk in their property and get a set of eyes on it. You could have things like leaks, other issues going on in the home, and not even realize it. With short-term rental properties, you've always got eyes on the property, whether it's your cleaners or handymen, or just regular new guests giving you information on what's going on in your home. But as a landlord, I've actually seen other landlords who own long-term rental properties and kind of neglect those properties. Never do any cleaning checks, never check on the property, don't really have a great relationship with their renters and ever follow up on what's going on in the home. And I actually have some friends who've experienced some very severe asset damaging things take place, such as floods, water damage. And while that could have been resolved if they had come across it right away, they didn't come across it until far too late, and it ended up costing all kinds of money to fix that. Con number two, locked-in pricing means less agile pricing management. What I mean by that is when you agree to a rental rate for a long-term tenant, whether that's monthly or annually, you've got that rate locked in, which means that a great rate today might actually be a huge deal later on in the year. As things change in the economy, as supply and demand are ebbing and flowing, you won't be able to act on those changes going on in the economy. And so whatever price you've committed to a long-term renter, that's the price that it's going to stay. And if you end up finding out that your price is quite low as compared to the rest of the market, you're not going to be able to do anything about that until your lease is up. Those are the two cons that I most come across as a landlord in the long-term rental space. But those cons are manageable. And there's a lot of great pros associated with long-term rentals, a lot of low-risk pros. Pro number one is the obvious, constant, predictable revenue. Whatever monthly rate you sent for rent in your long-term rental property, you can expect that income month over month. It's predictable, you know it's coming, it's easy to forecast. Obvious pro number two, you get to choose and properly screen your tenants. Oftentimes when I am trusting my assets with a long-term tenant, I really like to meet them in person and make sure it's a person that if I were living in that household, this is a person I'd actually like to share a home with. Somebody who you can trust your asset with, somebody who you know is not going to do any damage to the property, not be irresponsible, and not break any household rules that you might have for your assets. It's really easy to screen these people, and you really only have to do it once over the course of a year. The third obvious pro is there are a lot fewer costs to start. Whereas a short-term rental property, there are so much upfront costs for things such as furnishing the place, amenities, and other cool utilities that are going to add value to your home. Most tenants in the market who are looking for a long-term place to rent don't expect that. Pro number four kind of goes hand in hand with that, which is a lot of the other monthly associated costs can be offloaded to your tenants. We're talking about things like HOA fees in some cases, Wi-Fi, utility bills. These are all things that a lot of landlords get to offset to their tenants, whereas in a short-term rental strategy, you obviously aren't able to offload those costs. Those costs fall on you. And the last and final pro here is becoming increasingly important, which is that you will always have a market for a long-term rental property. There are very few HOAs, neighborhoods, even cities which ban and outlaw long-term rental properties, which means that as long as you've got a long-term rental asset, you'll be able to rent that out to a tenant anytime you'd like. But more and more HOAs, cities, as well as states are cracking down on things such as Airbnbs and short-term rentals, which means that investors who purchase a property, usually a luxury property, a premium costing property, with the intent of using it as an Airbnb, don't get to, and only find out after the fact, and sometimes months, even years after the fact, that they won't be able to use it with the intended nightly rental strategy that they had when they purchased the place. And that's a problem. So there's your long-term rentals. Long-term rentals have been a staple in just about any good investor's portfolio as far as building wealth, as well as setting yourself up for some nice passive income. There's a lot of pros to owning a long-term rental property and very manageable cons. But now let's talk about short-term rentals. This is something that became increasingly popular during the pandemic as more and more folks were able to travel and had a lot of disposable income. Short-term rentals, especially Airbnbs and VRBOs, were an asset class that a lot of investors wanted to dip their hands into. But there are some pros and some cons that I think anybody going into short-term rentals or considering short-term rentals should really be aware of. So let's talk about the pros here first. It's kind of flip-flop from what we just did. Pro number one is there's absolutely more potential revenue which can be earned in a nightly rental. There's no way around this. You can potentially earn more in a short-term rental than you could in the same property as a long-term rental. But this is going to depend on a few things such as seasonality and even economic conditions, as we're learning, which are tough to forecast for. I have found in a property which I actually use as a hybrid property, both for long-term renting as well as for short-term renting, and the same property just in two separate units, that I actually earn 50% more in the great season months in my short-term rental than I do in the long-term rental. But there are a few months where, all costs considered, I actually net more on the long-term rental side of that property than I do in the nightly rental property, and people need to be aware of that. Another great thing is you get more frequent attention to your property, whether it's yourself managing the property, whether it's a property manager, whether it's your cleaners or your handyman. More people have eyes on your property. If there are issues taking place, such as electrical issues, plumbing, anything else that can go wrong with a home, you're more likely to catch it sooner than in a long-term rental property where you might not catch something until months down the road. Third obvious pro here is you can adjust pricing rapidly, even daily, to maximize the revenue that you capture in a short-term rental property. In a long-term rental property, as soon as you set that lease with the tenant, your price is locked in. You know what revenue you can expect for the rest of the year. Even if something takes place in your area where suddenly there's way more demand than supply, and you know you could be charging more, you won't be able to until that agreed upon lease is up. But in a nightly rental, if you know that people are coming to your area either because of a concert or a business conference going on or anything else taking place in your area, you can adjust your prices either for the better or for the worse, just depending on how supply and demand is going in your area. And you can do this whenever you want. The last pro that's worth talking about is there's typically greater selling opportunity when you're ready to sell that investment down the road. I don't typically recommend flipping a property in less than a year's time. I know there's a lot of people out there that do that. I personally am not in favor of that. I like to purchase properties and own them a long time and generate as much passive income as I can. But one of the things that we learned during the pandemic are that properties that can be utilized as Airbnb, VRBO properties can absolutely be sold at a premium. All right, we've talked about some of the pros here. Let's get into some of the cons here for short-term rental properties. So con number one is obvious. There are obviously more costs associated with both starting as well as maintaining a short-term rental property. Most people assume that, know that, but aren't aware of some of the costs that are associated going into a short-term rental property. Here are just a few for your consideration. In addition to the cost of getting started, so we are talking about the TV you'll purchase, the couch, the bed, the mattress, the nice sheets, the replacement sheets, the towels, the soap, the cooking utensils, the cooking supplies, the appliances, and everything else that you need to get started in a short-term rental property. We'll make another video on this another day as far as things that I think you really should utilize to get started. But there are also a lot of monthly costs that go into maintaining a property as well. These include things such as your HOA fee, your utilities, your Wi-Fi bill, any subscriptions to things such as Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus that you want to offer to guests. Whatever you're paying your cleaners, whatever you're paying your handyman, you may even be paying a property manager to manage your property, which in some areas can charge as low as 15%, but as high as 40% of your gross revenue. And that's a lot of revenue. So it's important to factor all of those costs in calculating exactly what you can expect to earn, your net income, as opposed to just factoring in your gross income, which can be higher and more than you would generate from a long-term rental property. But all costs considered, sometimes that great gross revenue can be reduced very close to what you would earn with a long-term rental property, which is far less work. Con number 2 here is really important. I've absolutely seen new investors be totally wiped out due to this. The monthly income you'll experience can be completely variable. This is obviously going to depend on where you're located, what area you're invested in, but depending on where you're at, you may only have 3 months out of the year where people really want to stay in your vacation rental. The other 9 months, you might actually make less than what it costs to maintain your property. Now, I know great investors who net incredible returns on just the 3-month period where people are visiting their towns, either in great summertime months because there's things like beaches and events in their towns during the summer months, as well as investors who are invested in areas where people like to come skiing and so forth. But it's important to factor when starting a short-term rental, especially if you start a short-term rental in a really great season for your area. Not every month is going to net the same. In fact, there very well may be some months where you're dealing with a loss and you need to prepare for that. Con number 3 is an increased concern amongst investors now, which is that more HOAs, cities, and states are cracking down on nightly rental restrictions. Those of us who live in Utah are very aware of this. Obviously, we've got St. George to the south of us here, where a lot of those restrictions have already been implemented. There are specific areas which are zoned for nightly rental opportunity. In order to have a nightly rented property, you must purchase a home within these zones. And the zones are slowly dwindling, which isn't being talked about. This means that to purchase a property, you have to purchase at a premium, a home which is actually located in one of those spots. But it also means that by purchasing a property in one of those zone spots, that spot might not be zoned for nightly renting in a year or 2 years' time. And you need to factor that in for both when you go to sell that property as well as for the strategy going into the property as far as what you can expect month over month on your rental return. This is why I always say when you purchase a nightly rental, at least for my strategy, it's a really good idea only to purchase a property if the numbers make sense for both a nightly rental as well as a long-term rental. And then finally, the most obvious con here is every time you get a new guest, which hopefully is very frequently, you're playing Russian roulette with what kind of tenant you're experiencing that night. It's really hard to screen, to vet these people, especially when you've got up to 20 folks who are coming to stay in your home in a month's time. And that's if you have a 1-bedroom unit. If you've got a multiple bedroom unit, you could have hundreds of tenants in a month's time. And though platforms like Airbnb and VRBO do their absolute best to make sure that you're getting quality tenants, there are disaster stories across all platforms, and it's unavoidable. It can be anything from tenants who are very disrespectful and can damage your asset, up to worst case scenario, a squatter who's just looking for a place to live for the next 3 months. You gotta be prepared for all of that. So there you go, folks. The biggest pros and cons I see associated with both long-term rental investments as well as short-term rental investments. What do you think? Hopefully this helps you determine what rental class works best for you, your family, and your investment portfolio. If you like this content, go ahead and like and subscribe. Love you to join the family here. Let me know in the comments what you think, if there's anything else that I've forgotten, either in the long-term rental side or the short-term rental side. Until next time, folks, safe investing out there.